Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a small, quiet island in Washington. The air is still, and the only sound you hear is the faint rustling of leaves. Suddenly, you hear news that a 14-year-old boy has outsmarted not just the local police, but the FBI itself. Houses have been broken into, cars have been stolen, and now something unimaginable has happened. Planes have been disappearing from runways. Who could pull off such daring crimes? How could a teenager fly an airplane without any training? This isn't a movie plot. This is real life. This is the story of Colton Harris-Moore, the boy who became infamous as the Barefoot Bandit. Chapter 1. A Troubled Start. Colton Harris-Moore was born in 1991 on Camano Island, a quiet and picturesque place in the state of Washington, USA. But Colton's life was anything but peaceful. From the very beginning, his childhood was filled with struggles. His mother was addicted to alcohol and spent most of her time drunk, while his father was a drug addict who rarely stayed around. The constant fights between his parents eventually led to a bitter divorce, and Colton's father abandoned the family completely, leaving them with no money and no support. Colton and his mother lived in extreme poverty. Their home was small, broken down, and always filled with a sense of emptiness. Often, Colton would go to bed hungry because there simply wasn't enough food. He would hear other kids talking about their families, toys, and happy lives, but Colton's reality was far from that. His mother paid him little attention, and any hope for a normal childhood slowly slipped away. As a young boy, Colton found comfort not in people, but in the woods surrounding Camano Island. The thick forests became his escape from reality. He would spend hours alone, learning how to move quietly through the trees, observing animals, and figuring out how to survive. This time in the wild unknowingly prepared him for the life he would lead later, a life of hiding, escaping, and living off the land. At just 10 years old, hunger and frustration pushed Colton to take a step that would change his life forever. One evening, he sneaked into a neighbor's house and stole some food from their kitchen. It wasn't about greed or thrill, he simply wanted something to eat. But this small act of theft ignited something inside him. It gave him a sense of control over his miserable situation. For the first time, Colton felt like he could take something back from the world that had given him nothing. Over the next few years, Colton's crimes escalated. He started breaking into empty houses on the island, stealing food, money, and small valuable items. But unlike most thieves, Colton had a strange sense of ethics. He would often only take items that could be replaced through insurance claims. He wasn't trying to ruin anyone's life. He just wanted to survive. By the time Colton was 12 years old, the local police began to take notice of the increasing number of break-ins on Camano Island. People started reporting missing cash, food, and even electronics, but the break-ins were always clean and silent. No one could figure out who was behind them. The community was baffled. How could someone slip in and out of houses so easily without getting caught? Colton became increasingly bold. He began living out of a tent deep in the woods, far from anyone's reach. During the day, he would scout homes that looked empty. At night, he would break in, grab what he needed, and disappear back into the forest. He moved like a ghost, leaving no traces behind. But Colton wasn't perfect. One night, while stealing food from a supermarket, he tripped a silent alarm. The police arrived quickly and caught him red-handed. At just 12 years old, Colton was arrested for the first time and sent to a juvenile detention center. The juvenile detention center was a harsh place for a young boy like Colton. Surrounded by troubled kids and strict guards, Colton felt even more alone. But instead of breaking him, the experience fueled his resolve. He spent his time reading and quietly observing everything around him. He learned how the guards moved, when the routines changed, and how the system worked. Colton was a fast learner. He didn't waste a single moment. After serving his time, Colton was released back into his mother's care, but nothing had changed at home. His mother was still addicted to alcohol, and there was no food, no comfort, and no love. Colton realized he couldn't depend on anyone. If he wanted to survive, he had to rely on himself. At the age of 14, Colton left home for good. He disappeared into the woods, carrying nothing but a backpack and a few stolen supplies. He had no plan, no money, and nowhere to go. But what he did have was determination, intelligence, and an incredible ability to adapt. From this moment on, Colton Harris-Moore's life would take a path that no one could have imagined, a path that would make him one of the most wanted criminals in the United States, and a legend known as the Barefoot Bandit. Chapter 2. The Barefoot Bandit's escalation. Colton Harris-Moore's criminal activities continued to escalate in complexity and audacity after his initial break-ins on Camano Island. As his notoriety grew, so did the risks and the stakes. Colton's early crimes of petty theft soon evolved into something much more dangerous. By the time he was 16, his need for survival had pushed him to the brink, and his understanding of evading law enforcement had deepened significantly. While most teenagers were preparing for high school graduations or figuring out their future, Colton was becoming a criminal mastermind, known only by the nickname Barefoot Bandit, due to his notorious habit of stealing without being caught and his barefoot escapes. Colton's targets moved beyond simple homes and stores. His audacity knew no bounds. He began breaking into private airplanes and helicopters. In 2008, at just 16 years old, Colton stole his first plane, a small Cessna 182, from a private airfield on Orcas Island. The theft gained national attention as the story of a teenage runaway flying planes without any formal training spread across the media. The FBI and local law enforcement agencies scrambled to keep up with his increasingly brazen tactics. From 2008 to 2009, Colton managed to steal and fly multiple aircraft, including a Beechcraft Bonanza and even a stolen yacht. His expertise grew with each escape, utilizing remote airstrips and secluded waterways to avoid detection. The summer of 2009 marked a turning point in Colton's criminal career. Over the span of a few months, reports of missing planes from Washington's numerous small airstrips became alarmingly frequent. Law enforcement officers were left baffled. How could a teenage runaway with no flight training pilot planes with such precision? Colton didn't just rely on brute force to steal planes. His intelligence and resourcefulness were evident. He'd carefully study the layout of airports and flight schedules to identify opportunities. Once inside the cockpit, he would hotwire the planes and take off, often leaving the airport undetected for hours or even days. These daring flights across the Northwest became the stuff of legend. But Colton didn't limit himself to planes. In 2009, he also stole several luxury cars, yachts, and boats, leveraging his wilderness survival skills to remain off the radar. His ability to live off the grid, moving seamlessly between remote islands and forests, made him an elusive target. By mid-2009, Colton's crimes were no longer confined to Washington state. His reach had expanded into Oregon and Idaho. The FBI officially declared him a federal fugitive, and a massive manhunt was launched. The agency even used surveillance aircraft and satellite tracking to trace his movements. Despite their advanced technology, law enforcement struggled to capture Colton. He always seemed to be one step ahead, disappearing into the forests or navigating uncharted waters that were difficult to track. Public fascination grew as people wondered how a teenager with no formal education in flying managed to carry out such elaborate crimes. Colton Harris-Moore became a folk hero of sorts. The media portrayed him as both a daring outlaw and a victim of a broken system. Some admired his survival instincts and resourcefulness, while others viewed him as a dangerous criminal who should be stopped at all costs. Through all the headlines and chase sequences, Colton's reign as the Barefoot Bandit persisted, leaving behind a trail of stolen planes, cars, and yachts, and an insatiable desire for freedom that few criminals have ever achieved. This chapter marks the beginning of a more dramatic phase in Colton's criminal history, one that would lead to his eventual capture, but not without leaving an indelible mark on the world of criminal folklore. Chapter 3. The Hunt Begins. After Colton Harris-Moore's rise to infamy as the Barefoot Bandit, law enforcement agencies were determined to bring him to justice. What started as petty theft on Camano Island had escalated into federal crimes involving stolen planes, luxury vehicles, and maritime vessels. By 2010, the hunt for Colton had become a national pursuit, with the FBI, local law enforcement, and even private citizens working tirelessly to track him down. In 2010, Colton's crimes were no longer confined to remote areas. His daring thefts had garnered widespread attention, and the pursuit was no longer limited to Washington state. His theft of airplanes in broad daylight from busy airstrips raised questions of security and intelligence. The FBI's involvement escalated, with thousands of tips pouring in from the public, but Colton remained elusive. The investigation revealed a meticulous process behind his escapades. His ability to blend into the wilderness and disappear for days at a time baffled law enforcement. Even though Colton was just a teenager, his knowledge of escape routes, terrain, and technology far surpassed the capabilities of most seasoned criminals. One of Colton's most audacious crimes came in March 2010 when he stole a Cessna 182 from Orcas Island again, this time during a routine maintenance check. The plane was found several hours later in a remote field miles away from the airport, just another example of Colton's resourcefulness. It became evident that he had not only mastered the art of theft, but also the mechanics of flying aircraft, an activity he had never been formally trained for. Over the course of his criminal spree, Colton piloted at least 6 stolen planes across multiple states. The thefts became so frequent that several states had to tighten airport security protocols, using fingerprint scans and surveillance systems to monitor aircraft movement. Yet, Colton always managed to stay one step ahead. Colton's method of evading capture became even more sophisticated. He employed a variety of tactics, sometimes hitchhiking from one location to another, using stolen vehicles to throw off law enforcement, and disappearing into dense forests to create the illusion of being unreachable. Despite a $10,000 reward being offered by the FBI, no one could track his exact movements. In June 2010, after stealing a yacht from a marina in Seattle, Colton sailed through Puget Sound, leaving a trail of disbelief. He navigated the waters expertly, avoiding Coast Guard patrols and detection from ships. Authorities had no choice but to turn their attention to both land and sea in hopes of catching him. The story of the Barefoot Bandit became sensationalized in the media, with Colton gaining a mythical status. Some saw him as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from the wealthy for survival, while others labeled him a dangerous criminal who needed to be stopped. His name was plastered across newspapers and TV shows, with journalists and amateur sleuths speculating about his next move. Despite his crimes, Colton was smart enough to remain largely off the grid, relying on stolen credit cards and fake identities to maintain a low profile. His ability to blend into society became a puzzle law enforcement struggled to solve. Colton's reign as the Barefoot Bandit came to an end on July 11, 2010, when he was captured in a remote island in the Bahamas. Following an international manhunt involving multiple countries, Colton was eventually caught after authorities tracked him through the yacht theft and cell phone records. His capture marked the close of an era where a teenage runaway had managed to evade justice for years, leaving behind a legacy of audacity and survival. Chapter 4: The Fall of the Barefoot Bandit. After nearly 2 years on the run, Colton Harris-Moore's journey as the Barefoot Bandit came to an end in July 2010. His audacious crimes, ranging from stealing planes to yachts and luxury cars, had left law enforcement agencies across multiple states and even countries struggling to capture him. However, as the manhunt intensified, Colton's increasingly reckless behavior put him in a position where escape became nearly impossible. By 2010, the FBI had amassed a significant amount of intelligence on Colton Harris-Moore. His criminal empire had expanded beyond the Pacific Northwest to states like Oregon, Idaho, and even as far as Nevada. Yet, despite the advanced tracking technology and a massive team of agents, Colton continued to outwit law enforcement. His knowledge of remote hideouts, secluded forests, and unmonitored airstrips kept him one step ahead for the majority of his criminal spree. However, cracks began to show. The more audacious his crimes became, stealing and piloting planes without formal training, stealing luxury yachts, and even carjackings, the more exposed he became. Colton's youthful bravado and disregard for the law eventually led to mistakes, and his freedom began to narrow. One of the final defining moments of Colton's reign as the Barefoot Bandit was the theft of a $2.5 million luxury yacht in Seattle. In May 2010, Colton stole the 55-foot vessel named Indulgence from a private marina. The theft was bold and meticulous as he used sophisticated navigation systems to sail through Puget Sound. Yet his failure to fully disable the yacht's GPS tracking system became his undoing. Law enforcement tracked the vessel as it navigated toward the Canadian coast. After several days of evasion, Colton abandoned the yacht near a remote island in British Columbia, relying on the wilderness to evade capture once again. But this time, the FBI and Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, were ready. On July 11, 2010, Colton Harris-Moore was captured in the Bahamas by the RCMP and FBI. His arrest came after a months-long international manhunt aided by advancements in tracking technology, analysis of stolen electronics, and tips from the public. Colton's journey through the Pacific Northwest, multiple states, and eventually foreign territories ended when he was spotted in the Bahamas, living aboard a boat registered under a false name. His capture was a dramatic moment. The FBI described it as a precision operation that took place in a remote, wooded area. Colton did not resist, though he showed no signs of remorse for his actions. The fugitive who had stolen planes, yachts, and cars had finally been caught, bringing an end to one of the most infamous crime sprees in U.S. history. Following his capture, Colton Harris-Moore faced multiple federal and state charges. He was indicted on charges ranging from aircraft theft and auto theft to burglary and identity theft. Despite his youthful age, prosecutors sought serious penalties for his crimes due to the scale of his escapades and the danger they posed to public safety. In November 2011, Colton pled guilty to federal charges. He was sentenced to over 6 years in prison, though his legal troubles extended beyond the United States. In 2012, Canada also charged him for his crimes involving stolen yachts and vehicles within their borders. Colton's story didn't end with incarceration. After serving time, he began efforts toward rehabilitation, focusing on self-education and writing. His experiences have been documented in interviews and books, giving him a somewhat notorious, though introspective, public image. Colton Harris-Moore's legacy remains a complex one, ranging from a symbol of rebellion against a broken system to a cautionary tale of youthful crime spiraling into nationwide infamy. His fall from the skies marked the end of a sensational chapter in American criminal history, but his impact continues to be discussed even years after his capture. Chapter 5. The Barefoot Bandit's Legacy. Colton Harris-Moore's story, once the stuff of headlines and sensational news, has left an indelible mark on American criminal history. His audacious crimes, daring escapes, and ultimate capture have sparked discussions about survival, resilience, and the line between rebellion and crime. Though his criminal career ended in July 2010, his story continues to be analyzed, interpreted, and debated. Colton's rise from a troubled childhood to a nationally sought-after fugitive highlighted the cracks within social systems that failed to provide support for vulnerable youth. His early years were marked by neglect, poverty, and a lack of stability, factors that many argue contributed to his criminal behavior. However, his ability to adapt, learn, and execute complex criminal activities has left behind a complex legacy, one that continues to intrigue both the public and criminal experts alike. From the moment his crimes made national headlines, Colton Harris-Moore captured the attention of the public. His story became the subject of documentaries, books, and even film adaptations, portraying him in various lights, from a modern-day Robin Hood to a dangerous outlaw. The media's portrayal often blurred the lines between fact and fiction, creating a fascination that persists even years after his capture. In 2012, a documentary titled The Barefoot Bandit was released, delving into his life and crimes with interviews from law enforcement, psychologists, and journalists. The film touched on both the psychological profile of a young criminal mastermind and the challenges faced by authorities in apprehending someone so elusive. Experts studying Colton's story have explored how his childhood experiences shaped his criminal trajectory. His deep connection with nature, combined with his ability to live off the grid for extended periods, underscores a unique ability to survive in adverse circumstances. Psychologists argue that his crimes were not purely acts of desperation, but were also driven by a need for autonomy and control in a life that was devoid of stability. Many have speculated that Colton's ingenuity and problem-solving skills, developed during his years in the wild, played a significant role in his criminal activities. Whether breaking into homes, stealing vehicles, or piloting planes, his ability to adapt and think ahead demonstrated a level of intelligence that surpassed his age. While some saw Colton as a misguided youth who had been wronged by society, others viewed him as a dangerous criminal who endangered countless lives with his reckless actions. His theft of airplanes and yachts placed him at the center of dangerous situations where innocent lives could have been at risk. Law enforcement and victims alike pushed for justice to ensure accountability for his crimes, which ranged from theft to identity fraud. Following his conviction, Colton's sentencing reflected the severity of his crimes. He faced years in prison, but upon release, his life beyond crime has been a topic of interest. In interviews, Colton has expressed remorse for his actions, citing that his experiences in the criminal world were never intended to hurt anyone, only to survive. Today, Colton Harris-Moore's story is no longer just about his crimes, but about the broader conversation surrounding social justice, rehabilitation, and the impact of childhood neglect on criminal behavior. His case has influenced discussions on how society can better address the root causes of crime and offer support to youth struggling with unstable backgrounds. Though his time in the spotlight has faded, the Barefoot Bandit's legacy lives on, an enduring tale of survival, rebellion, and the limits of human ingenuity against the forces of law enforcement. Chapter 6. Life After the Barefoot Bandit. Colton Harris-Moore's journey from a troubled youth to a national fugitive and eventual incarceration was one of the most talked about stories of its time. However, his story did not end with his capture in July 2010. After serving time, Colton had to navigate a world vastly different from the wilderness he once called home. His post-incarceration life has been a topic of interest, with many wondering how someone who once lived outside the law would reintegrate into society. Following his sentencing, Colton Harris-Moore was imprisoned for several years. His time behind bars, however, was spent focusing on education, personal growth, and preparing for a new chapter in his life. He took advantage of rehabilitation programs and educational opportunities offered within the prison system. Colton earned his GED and explored areas of interest such as writing and music, aiming to turn a new leaf. In 2016, after serving part of his sentence, Colton was released on parole. His release was not without its challenges, as he had to adapt to a life shaped by legal restrictions and the public's perception of his past. Despite completing his prison term, Colton Harris-Moore remained a controversial figure in the eyes of the public. His crimes had gained significant media attention, and the fascination with his story did not dissipate after his arrest. Public interest in his post-incarceration life led to media appearances, interviews, and discussions on his transformation. However, re-entry into society wasn't easy. Colton faced skepticism from the public and struggles with finding legitimate employment. His past reputation as a notorious criminal followed him, and many were unsure if he could truly leave his criminal past behind. In recent years, Colton has worked towards rebuilding his life. Beyond personal development, he has become involved in advocacy and community work. Through public speaking engagements and educational programs, he shares his experiences to raise awareness about youth crime, rehabilitation, and second chances. His message focuses on personal accountability and the importance of supporting troubled youth through constructive means rather than punitive measures alone. Colton's outreach efforts have been met with mixed reactions. While some praise his efforts to turn his life around, others remain cautious, questioning whether his transformation is genuine or simply a response to public pressure. Despite his efforts toward reintegration, Colton Harris-Moore's post-incarceration life is heavily regulated by legal restrictions. He is monitored closely by authorities, with parole conditions that include limitations on travel, social media activity, and interactions with minors. These restrictions reflect the seriousness of his past crimes and the potential risk to public safety. However, Colton has maintained a relatively low profile compared to his fugitive days. His focus on personal growth and contributing positively to society continues to define his path forward. Looking back, Colton often reflects on his journey, from a troubled child lost in the woods to a notorious criminal, and ultimately to someone seeking redemption. His life story serves as both a cautionary tale and an example of resilience and the ability to change. Colton Harris-Moore's future remains uncertain, yet he remains committed to proving that change is possible, even for those who have crossed lines society deems unforgivable. His story, though one of crime and infamy, is now also a story of transformation and second chances, a testament to the complexities of human nature and the potential for growth beyond one's past. Colton Harris-Moore's story is one of resilience and adaptability. From a troubled childhood marked by abandonment and struggle, he rose to notoriety through his audacious crime. However, his journey was not just about survival. He managed to learn, grow, and eventually carve out a path toward redemption. Colton's experiences reflect the power of resilience and personal evolution. Despite his past, he navigated life with intelligence and creativity, leaving behind a legacy of transformation and perseverance. His story serves as a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there is always the possibility for change and growth.